Bonjour tout le monde. Welcome everyone. And this is our last activism conversation here at the Canadian New Music Network. We are coming to you from all kinds of places across Turtle Island. I am here in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, in lands and waters that are held in trust but on unceded territories of the Kanien'kehá:ka people. And we're very happy to have our speakers from the Toronto area, Ottawa, and Calgary. It's my pleasure to introduce to you our moderator for today's session, Cole Chaikie, and I'll let him take it away and start this conversation about access for you all.
Great. Thank you, Terry. Hi, everybody. My name's Cole Chaikie, like Terry mentioned. And just to start, I want to thank Terry for bringing us together. I've enjoyed the conversations we've had and really loved watching the videos that we kind of collectively in our own silos and then we're combined to create, talking about accessibility in our different art practices in different ways. So thank you, Terry, and everyone at CNMN for supporting us and bringing us together. So I'll introduce myself and then we'll kind of go around our Zoom room here and introduce, everyone will have a chance to introduce themselves. And then we're just gonna start talking. There's so many fascinating points that came up for me in everyone's work that I'm just really keen to ask about and dig into and start tying some threads in between our individual work. So my name's Cole. I work at a company called Inside Out Theatre, which is a deaf, disability, and mad theatre company here in Calgary, Alberta. Calgary, also known by its Blackfoot name Mohkinstsis, is in Treaty 7 land, which is the home of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda Nations, as well as the Métis Region number 3. Mohkinstsis, the Blackfoot name, talks about the meeting point between our two rivers here in Calgary, the Elbow and the Bow, and where I am literally now at Inside Out, I'm about 100 meters away from the Bow. And so I love connecting to the land and the water that runs through our area. Down, you know, it started out where you folks are out east and it's heading west and I'm just a point along the way. And that's a nice frame of reference for me to think of. Let's start. We'll just start by going around and introducing ourselves. And I'm just gonna, you know, spin around clockwise on my view here, which starts with you, Chelsea. You'd like to introduce yourself and say hi, tell us who you are, where you are, what you do.
Sure thing. Thanks, Cole. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. Thank you to Terry and everyone at CNMN, which is always a bit of a tongue twister for me, for hosting this. And Cole, thank you for your moderation. My name is Chelsea Jones. My pronouns are she and her. I am a white Spoonie settler, and I'm an assistant professor at Brock University in the Department of Child and Youth Studies. And a lot of my work has to do with cripping the arts in Canada. And that's sort of where I find myself in my research. I'm originally from Saskatchewan. And when I recorded my video, that's part of this session, I was in Toronto and now I'm in Hamilton. So I seem to be moving about quite a bit. And I'm still getting to know where I am. I'm a recently new to Hamilton, or the Hammer, as the cool kids call it. And I live near the escarpment, the Niagara Escarpment, which if you haven't been, it's this big part of Turtle Island that looks kind of like a huge cliff full of trees. And it's about 400 million years old. And Indigenous people have been foundational in preserving this biosphere for a very long time. So it is my summer project to learn about this place and to think about what it means to be here on the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement, which is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people. Would you like me to pass it, Cole, or pass it back to you?
Oh, please pass it on. That'd be great.
Okay, if we're going clockwise, the person next to me is Julie.
Hi, Chelsea. Thanks for introducing me. Hi, Ellen. Hi, Cole. Very glad to finally get to have this real discussion live with all of you. So just to let everybody know, I might step and skip between English and French. Let me get started in French and, you know, bear with me. So, mon nom, c'est Julie Richard. Je suis une Canadienne haïtienne qui habite présentement le territoire de Montréal. En fait, depuis les 20 dernières années, je travaille en intervention auprès de jeunes d'âge et préscolaire et de primaire et de secondaire. J'enseigne au collège Jean-Eudes. Je travaille principalement à faire reconnaître le travail des compositrices africaines-américaines qui ont été, dont la présence a été obscurcie dans l'histoire des musiques européennes, puis d'allégeance classique. D'un autre côté, je travaille en soins hospitaliers avec les clientèles de centres d'hébergement pour personnes âgées. Donc, je suis un peu multidisciplinaire dans mon approche. So, as I was saying, I teach in high school. I also work in preschool music teaching mainly. I'm a classical music composer from a classical background. I work into shining light on those forgotten African-American classical composer, trying to bring light to their work and get us used to their contribution and curious about it. So I work mainly for an ensemble called Les Angles Morts and the Black Arc Orchestra. Now I guess I should pass to Hélène.
Thanks, Julie. And it really is a pleasure to get to have an actual conversation over Zoom with all four of you, four of us. And thanks again to Terry and everyone at CNMN for convening this. So I am a white settler Canadian. My various branches of my family have lived in Canada for many generations. I grew up in the prairies in Treaty 1 territory in Port au Prairie, Manitoba. And some parts of my family came here unwillingly. My grandfather on my father's side was a Bernardo boy who was a baby shipped to Canada to be, because of poverty in England and no one to take care of him there. I work in Ottawa on unceded Algonquin territory, and I'm grateful for these complex histories that we're having to navigate and think about, where we're the call to understand who's your mom and where are you from, to recognize that we live in a current social moment where we can't take anything for granted, ought not to take anything for granted, and ought to be really relearning how to be with one another in every moment. I'm a flutist and improviser, and I work in a university at Carleton University, where I'm responsible for directing the Research Center for Music, Sound, and Society in Canada. That's me.
Great. Thank you, Ellen, and thank you all. Wonderful. So just the brief little background is that pre-pandemic, just before the initial plan was that we were all going to get together in person, I believe at the National Forum, when that was, for obvious reasons, sidelined. The first thing we did after a Zoom conversation or two was we each contributed a short video talking about our own interpretation and experience in considering and deepening access in our own practices and communities. And that video was compiled into a really lovely online document that I'm sure somewhere, we're also, slight background, we're in our own little Zoom bubble. blissfully unaware of what's happening on the Facebook live stream. So I'm going to imagine that somewhere on this Facebook event page is a link to the full video document that we kind of collectively created. And then this conversation is a chance for us to continue that conversation with each other. I thought it was really remarkable that there are, very distinct practices that we're all working within, but a lot of commonalities and shared values for sure, and some shared and complementary practices. So this is kind of a chance for us to, in a lot of ways, celebrate and, fan out over each other's work, and to start to pull in some of those commonalities. I do want to just share one reflection from all the work that the three of you were talking about that I just really deeply appreciated, is that when each of you were discussing the ways that you approach accessibility and the projects that you were mentioning, we were all talking about engaging with folks as either full active participants or as artists. And that I'm just grateful that this conversation about accessibility just leapfrogged over audience accessibility, which is very important. At Inside Out, we have a whole program called The Good Host dedicated to increasing cultural and cultural accessibility for audiences. But as a broader mandate for our work here at Inside Out, and what I heard in all of your work, is that accessibility does not and cannot end at the audience level, and that the goal is to go towards cultural exchange and engaging everyone as full active participants in the culture that we're surrounded in. And I really appreciated that in your own ways, the way that you were embracing accessibility was to engage people as full participants. I know for me in my world here in Calgary, in our arts and culture community, we've talked a lot and work a lot and spend a lot of time considering equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility. So much so, those words become so familiar and so commonly used that I find, because they're so familiar and almost ubiquitous, they can lose its potency or meaning sometimes. And so I sometimes find it helpful to just find relevance synonyms for those words, where equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility can also be discussed as fairness and variety and belonging and participation, which I think is a good synonym for accessibility. We're really talking about opening up participation for everybody. And so the first, one of the beautiful ideas I heard in our video that I want to maybe start with is with you, Julie, because you talked about the work you were doing in seniors' homes and with older folks, particularly folks experiencing or living with dementia or Parkinson's, about maximizing participation in those communities, which is just a beautiful phrase that I loved. And I also particularly wanted to mention you recognizing for facilitators or teachers in those worlds, when you described it, or at least the subtitles described it, as a unilateral process of facilitation, and that introduced barriers to participation. And that resonated with me a lot in talking about inaccessibility and barriers in terms of practice and process and facilitation. So, which is really just a prompt and offer to you, Julie, to start us off about either that aspect of accessibility in your work in those senior care homes, or whatever that springs to mind for you.
Yeah. Well, first, I'd like to acknowledge that I had a lot of freedom, and that was to come up with any type of program I would fancy, which is not always the case, because most times we need to work under funding and subvention, and we need to provide a result, and that wasn't the case for me. So I had a full opportunity to take my time and seeing what would actually present itself by working with a certain community, what was there to work with, I had no plan to follow up in terms of, well, this week number 1, we need to achieve this. There was really not goal oriented. We had nothing to win by offering a presentation, or I had nothing that would stress myself. So that gave me the opportunity to see what the people I was working with wanted to do. And it was my responsibility, and I think it is always part of us responsibility to create out of what is offered to us through our people. I would switch in French real quick. Alors voilà, juste pour dire, c'est vraiment facile d'arriver dans une communauté et de développer un programme lorsqu'on n'a pas de barrière, de répondre à certains enjeux de subvention ou de devoir répondre à des objectifs et de démontrer un résultat potent pour maintenir un programme en place. Dans ce moment, j'ai eu la chance de passer une année complète auprès d'une communauté et d'observer ce qui venait des participants, de quelle façon ces gens-là intervenaient dans des activités qui étaient autres que la mienne, et de voir quelles étaient leurs barrières, où est-ce que c'était pas possible pour eux d'intervenir, d'interagir ou d'agir avec l'activité. Donc, j'ai eu la chance de pouvoir monter un programme qui était basé exactement sur les désirs de cette communauté-là. So just to close up that, just to say that, yeah, it was an opportunity for me to have the chance to work out of what the community that I'm working with wants and can do. That's not always the case, unfortunately. Most of the time, we're just like we're using programs. Anyway, for me, I know I'm teaching in high school. I need to use a program. There's so much freedom I can offer myself or offer the students, and it wouldn't be exactly saw as something really positive if I would start acting that way in another academic setting. But I believe that when we work with small scales organization and community, it gives us that freedom to get a little bit out of the way and see how we can serve the community and just magnify what they're giving us. And barely just to ask to be there as a translator almost, and to optimize their own vision. I'm not sure if I'm clear enough, but I feel extremely lucky at the chance to work in that way. It's extremely satisfying to see how it empowers the community you're working with in a real strong way.
Yeah, thank you, Julia. I think that empowerment is really palpable in the work that you do, and really flipping the power dynamics of that unilateral facilitation direction that can be standard sometimes, where it's the care worker or artist or teacher or whoever is there strictly to one way impart these skills. In your video, you use the word that it becomes something for participants or community members to endure, rather than getting to the chance to fully co-create. And that's a very recognizable thing that I think a lot of us have noticed in work that's well-intentioned, but not actually achieving, the goals that you're setting out. It does remind me, Chelsea, I really appreciated in your video the way that you recognized some of the barriers and challenges of working, you were mentioning about in post-secondary schools that have histories of not just being benignly inaccessible to people with disabilities, but actually very troubled, active histories of oppression and harm, and how that is a very real barrier to re-engaging or repairing relationships as you're welcoming like some of the artists with disabilities that you work with. I would love to hear you expand on that.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I was thinking earlier, Cole, when you were sort of saying that we have this kind of equity, diversity, and inclusion language, this kind of EDI language, that sort of becomes like a buzzword, right? It becomes a bit hollow and sometimes doesn't hold the meaning that perhaps we want it to, in part because it sometimes is implemented in ahistorical ways or in superficial ways that invite people in, or as Julie was saying, that invite people to sort of endure an intervention without actually sort of adopting some of these come as you are, embodied ways of being that I think both Julie and Ellen mention in their presentations and also in their interventions. This idea that the body that you have can work and can do things, and already espouses and inhabits the artistry that is needed for the project or for the thing that you want to do. And sometimes I think, in the field of critical disability studies, it's sometimes known as inclusionism. So this idea that it's, we need to do more than just include people in systems that have been oppressive and continue to be oppressive, and universities are that way. We need to actually, think about changing sort of the underlying structures, or at least challenging those structures, and understanding what it means for people to come to these places in whatever form that might be and engage in artistry. We see this also in interventions like relaxed performance, for example, where part of relaxing a performance is to do more than just make the audience comfortable, although Cole, as you said, that's important. But part of relaxing a performance might be understanding the history of the building that you're in, understanding the history of the performance and how it came about and who wrote it and what power relations were at play. And I think so too, in the kind of creative interventions that we're discussing, there's something to be said for understanding the context and what it means for people to show up and be part of it and to access the arts. Because if we're doing something that is, inherently eugenic, inherently colonial, and then saying, come on down and join us, then we have to start wondering, what's at the root of that, especially when people don't show up. There is a question of why that can't always be answered with sort of empty discourse about equity, diversity, and inclusion.
Thank you, Chelsea, very much. And Ellen, I see you nodding along a lot. And, thinking about histories and context, I appreciate how you were talking about classical music as also one that brings a lot of history and norms and things like that, and how at times your improvisation practice seems to crack open some of those norms a bit and maybe make a little more space for just a meeting space, crack it open to make a meeting space from people from different backgrounds to make music together and collaborate. I would love to hear a bit about that from your perspective.
Well, I think it can, but I don't think we should assume it will, right? So I think, again, everything depends on the sensibility that you bring to that moment of improvisation, the invitation, the generosity, the willingness to understand that everybody is in a different kind of body, a different kind of way of encountering the world, so that how we define music, or something we might call listening, isn't about whether you can hear through your ears, or whether you sense touch in your body, or whether you can move or not move, or speak or not speak. It becomes about your willingness to be intimately in that moment with other people, right? And you said something in your introduction to the video that when I was looking back at it, really struck me. You said that accessibility helps us build tools to create moments of cultural exchange. Mm-hmm. And I feel like if improvisation is helpful, it's if it's that kind of tool, right? The possibility for improvisation is that we don't have a script. We don't know what's going to happen yet. So that means there's always a moment where everybody could respond. But if we're turning away, if we're defining excellence or good music or just music as in a particular way, then we can be recreating those barriers as fast as we're removing them, right? So I love that idea of any of our musical propositions as tools that could be accessible. And if they're accessible, they create those moments where such an exchange is possible.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Ellen. I'm glad that stuck out to you. And you know, part of our background here at Inside Out, the idea of accessibility as a mode to cultural exchange is also rooted in our sort of philosophy and belief here at Inside Out that when we talk about deaf artists or disabled artists or mad artists, we're really talking about deaf culture and disability culture and disability justice, mad pride, mad practice, and mad culture, that these are rich cultural communities. You know, in the deaf community, in particular, as a rich linguistic community, and that yeah, creating accessibility is a two-way street. You know, I have deaf colleagues here at Inside Out, and we have interpreters at all of our staff meetings and things like that. And it's a mindset shift to articulate and reinforce that those interpreters are there largely for me. If we, you know, if two of our deaf staff members are working together, they're within their culture and community and linguistic practice, and they don't need an interpreter. But if I need to join that meeting, or if we need to chat, or if I'm going to collaborate with them, in a lot of ways, that interpreter is there to serve my deficit, my language deficit, because I'm not fluent in sign language. And that's that cultural exchange that happens when I can work alongside and we can connect with each other.
I'd love to speak to that a little bit if I could. I have a remarkable opportunity right now. I'm working on a score for improvisation that is meant to be something that would be very accessible, that all kinds of bodies could interpret. And I've had the capacity to collaborate with Spill Propagation in Gatineau. They're Tiffany Giraud and Paula Bath. And Tiffany is a deaf and a theater artist, and Paula is a cultural studies person and a hearing person. So we've had this, for me, incredibly precious opportunity to exchange the way that we understand music. I would record something, I would send it to Paula, and through a vibrotactile vest, Tiffany would listen to my music and then create a graphic score, draw her representation of that music and send it back to me. And along with the vest at a certain point. So two things struck me. One was I could not believe the accuracy with which Tiffany was feeling what the musical structure, the musical ingredients, like never mind even a beautiful poetic interpretation, but the actual, you know, fundamental nuts and bolts of what was going on in the music, however defined. So that was thing one. And thing two was when I put the vest on and tried to perceive the music in the same way, I had no competency. I was stupid at feeling those vibrations. I could feel the vibrations, but I couldn't interpret them in that way, right? So the tables were turned. It's, as you say with the interpreter, I realized it is not that Tiffany is deaf, it's that I don't know how to interpret vibrations. You know, these two things are true at the same time. And you know, it's making me realize all over again how important this work is to be able to engage in, how precious it is to engage in, because we learn how limited our sensory competencies are, our sensory knowledge is, when we assume that we're actually able, and not only that, but trained to be a musician, to hear very finely, whatever, and then to discover that there's a whole dimension that I actually am very bad at and have no need to learn. Like that's just blown my mind. It's amazing to discover you don't know anything.
Yeah.
All over again, right?
Well, I'm so happy for you, Ellen. You're having that experience and getting that opportunity to grow. That's wonderful. I just want to open up to Chelsea or Julie as well. As you were, listening to this conversation or looking back at the video that we had created, if there were things that had really struck you, or maybe connections that you saw between your practice and someone else's that we could take this chance to discuss a little.
Yeah, I might want to enrich. I mean, definitely, I've seen so many ways into our practices are like really crossing paths. Just to say, this thing that I've heard from everyone was in a way that Ellen said it at one point during her video presenting her work, where you said sometimes I'm leaving and I'm going out for a supper and I leave the space and I thought, that this is fantastic. It seems to be something strong, the fact that your presence might be needed, but we need to rethink what our presence is, and change the way we interact with other creators. And that was very touching to see that it is done in other practices, that it's done differently and it could happen in a different way. And I'd be really curious eventually to just leave the room too, and not worried about anything. This could happen without me, of course. It doesn't need me, in fact, I'm here to learn. It is an opportunity for me to learn. If I see it that way, it will be such an enriching experiences. And it was really fun to notice that. Chelsea, you said it in a different way too. And I loved when you said inclusion is not enough. It kept ringing in my head, and it still does, and it will feed a lot of my future thinking. And thanks for that. That was a brief parenthèse. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's such an important step, though, that learning to let go of, or this is my experience of notions of like control, and ego. For me, sometimes it comes up like letting go and being like, I'm going to step back, and that's great. Not just okay, but like that's a really positive move to let go of. Like often, from a caring place, like wanting to make sure that everyone's okay, make sure that everyone's supported and cared for. But to learn when to go for supper and leave people to improvise by themselves.
Well, the university is paying my salary.
That's right. Yeah, Chelsea.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of add on to what my colleagues are saying. This idea of sort of decentering ourselves, whether that means decentering the researcher or the musician or the facilitator, or whatever we might be in a particular moment. I did also see that theme shining through in all of the videos. And one question that really sort of continued ringing in my mind came from Ellen, and from your video, Ellen, where you sort of asked, okay, so if we engage in this practice of decentering people who have normally or traditionally taken on these leadership roles, what does that mean for the future? What does it mean for the future of the university if we have access in mind? What does it mean if we're thinking about practice in an intergenerational way, like in Julie's work, where I think I remember in the video, 2 kids, Jolie and Laura, I think their names were, from Little Burgundy, and there's sort of this intergenerational edge to it. So if we sort of take away this imagined person at the center who is of a certain age and who has a certain amount of skill and talent that's been taught to them in traditional ways, what happens and who fills that sort of gap? What does access look like if we remove that sort of normative expectation? And what does it mean for who takes this place in terms of leadership, in terms of mentoring, in terms of skill sharing? So those were some of the things I was thinking of in relation to the videos, and in this sort of push away from the traditional kind of facilitator and client role, or teacher and student role, or however you might want to look at it. And so all that to say that Julie and Ellen's videos had me thinking about the future, and what this means for the future.
What would you like it to mean, Chelsea, for in your own life and work? Sorry, Cole, I took over here.
This is best case scenario. We just
I mean, you know, one thing that we really focus on in the work that I do is this concept from cryptechnoscience, which is called knowing making, which basically means that we try to assume or try to act in a way that assumes that the people with intellectual disabilities in our project come to the project with skill and with knowledge, and then we collaborate. It's not like a training project or something where we're trying to teach people how to do something so they can go away and do it. And it's, you know, what would I like it to look like? I mean, I would love to see that implemented in some of these spaces. So if I think about the university, for example, I would love to see people with intellectual disabilities in leadership roles, bringing their knowledge in and assumed to have knowledge. These are people who still, to this day, face tremendous access barriers in even attending university. And these are the kind of access barriers that, Ellen, you described so thoroughly in your video when you describe sort of the assumed music student who might come to your program and what the requirements for entry entail, even though the program itself has all these different avenues that a student could take to sort of realize their ambitions and their desires. So I still think there's a huge sort of schism between what we wish would happen and what in reality is happening. And so for me, it's seeing more folks with disabilities in these leadership roles. And part of that means, you know, sort of getting to the table to begin with. I guess that's my answer.
Well, such a good question. I would love to pass that question to Julie as well, about what your dreams are for the future. And also, if you want to chat a little bit about the young kids engaging with the work, the music from the older folks, because that intergenerational cultural exchange was also a highlight of watching your work. But take those one at a time, or whatever whatever pops into your mind first.
Now, in terms of what I'm hoping, it's definitely, you know, the fact that, like, I was very touched also by what Ellen was saying, and true, like, if it isn't accessible for everyone to show up and to get a space in a university level, and I'd love to see that while I'm alive. Like, I'm very hoping that some people take that at heart and we see things changing, like, honestly, because it is unfortunate, I'd have to say. It's definitely something I see also, because I see also my teenagers, like, looking at a future in arts and having to be really realistic towards what they can actually do, and the amount of work that them and their families, if they're lucky enough to have one, will have to put in order for them to follow the traditional path of studying. So I'm definitely, it's really, you think about that when you work with teenagers, and you're getting them, you're trying to give them the tools to navigate the world, not only it has to be above the improvisation. And actually, even though I'm saying I'm leaving space, I'm always trying to give them some tools to put in the backpack of normality, just so they can survive while we're trying to figure out an easier path for them, you know. So I'm thinking it will always be our role to, if there is a role to be having in those institutions and everywhere else, is to prepare that little backpack of how to navigate this world as it is now, while trying to encourage and empower and value what it is that is their unicity and their totally valid uh, way of moving around artistically, or you know. We have to review the terms normalcy. Definitely, it is something else we have to do. And that brings me to the second point. You know, there was something very interesting that we saw, because most traditionally I would work with the younger crew doing numeric music with programming with computers and DJing and working with keyboards in a really traditional way somehow, because they request it. And they want to have that. And I think it's also part of the baggage, the luggage that I'm giving them. So I'm happy to do that. But it was problematic at one point where they were trying to integrate um, our older folks' contribution into their music, because it didn't exactly fit a format. They couldn't fit it in their songs the way they thought they had. So they had to review how to work in a totally different manner, and not to try to push their vision onto something, but to open themselves to what has been given and work around that. And that gave them so much more freedom and relaxation. And I was really happy it just happened in a way that I didn't have to force that on them. They realized it would just be much easier if they change their idea of what that musical phrase had to be, or we can't respect that 4/4 format, doesn't fit anymore. And there's, of course, we could chop and cut and like work around it and like really, but there's other ways that we could bring that music alive and let that live, and you know, make that into a fantastic piece. But it's far from what we had in mind when we started 5 months ago. So yeah, there was a piece of to link to what Hélène was saying about, you know, the traditional forms of learning. And sometimes you just get the opportunity, it comes by itself to go somewhere else, and it's where the magic happens, you know.
Yeah, it's wild to hear how early kids, when they're in early music education or art education or whatever, are already without, you know, unless wonderful interventions like what you're just describing happen, how early they can be recruited into those systems and structures, and reinforcement, like what's standard, what's the norm, what's the canon, you know, how does this work, and this is the way it works. So how just glad I am for those lucky kids to have that experience at that age, that pivotal learning point, to reinforce flexibility and acceptance and spontaneity and change. But yeah, but also just struck that otherwise, you know, how early we all were brought into this system without even really knowing it.
But I think that often if you give people the space and the opportunity, they'll make those kinds of expansive, generous decisions. You know, this is exactly what would happen when I would leave my improvisation class and let people work out things among themselves. And last summer, when we were working with orchestra musicians from the National Arts Center Orchestra and the Sunshine Family's clients, we didn't have to prompt the orchestra musicians very much at all. You know, they were not resistant. They were really wanting to make it work, and they wanted to make it work for the pleasure of the folks at Sunshine Families, which didn't mean that they had every tool to do that, or that they didn't have their own baggage. You know, they also had this kind of idea that they ought to be teaching something, because they're often in that position, right? So they felt bad if they weren't teaching something. But that's beside the point. When you just got in the moment of music making, if there was the space, the magic would happen. They would make the decision every time to wait for someone to respond, to allow those beautiful silences that you talk about, Chelsea, in your presentation, to occur and just inhabit them. And I don't know. I think there's a lot in this work that just opens up our capacity to respond. Maybe that's what it is.
Yeah, if I can pick up on that a little bit, the idea of opening up our capacity to respond, I think that's so pivotal to accessing the arts and to making arts accessible. I so often, you know, the access piece gets reduced to kind of a compliance-based checklist, and those sometimes look different regionally. And depending on sort of who's around. And I think that those checklists can be important because they can help us stay on track, and sometimes they're community developed. And so we know, you know, for example, we have a checklist of what kind of sign language we might need in a certain region, or something like that. And they can be really helpful, but, you know, so much of access can be improvised and can be improvisational, and can happen in creative ways that contribute to the idea that there is such thing as sort of a disability aesthetic, or there is such thing as you know, being invited into a cultural exchange that is not normative in the first place. And I think I just think that's really important, what you're both saying, Ellen and Julie, about this sort of capacity to open things up, rather than to have to be completely compliant all the time, but to find new ways and to make space for that to happen seems important to me.
Mm.
How does that play out in your own work, Cole?
Yeah, I think, you know, I'm still thinking a bit about a couple things. One is, the idea of like cultural exchange, of embracing and promoting and celebrating deaf culture, disability culture, and mad culture, and as well as the inclusionism. Is that right, Chelsea? Is that the phrase you use? Yeah, that I think when unexamined, there's a real danger of inclusion actually meaning assimilation, and the real danger of that. And so expanding our understanding of all these different cultures as additive, as we need to grow the cultural landscape, not just make it more inclusive or more accessible, but actually expanding all of our notions of what makes culture that we live in is really important. Yes, that's what I was thinking. That's what was on my mind. This is a slight new thought or new question. But another thing that I really appreciated in the videos, and I'm just keen to hear more about from you, Chelsea, is the element of the artists with disabilities or disabled artists that you were meeting or interviewing for a research project, living areas, like living outside of urban centers. And just that broader understanding of how location and access to other people and services or cultural centers can be a compounding or complicating factor when we're talking about access and culture. So yeah, I would just love to hear a little bit about that, Chelsea.
Sure. Well, one of the reasons that the people I research with, we wanted to sort of focus on disabled artists living in rural or remote areas, in part because, these larger sort of Cripping the Arts movements are tremendous and they do these amazing things. But often they sort of are like housed in places like Toronto and Vancouver and even smaller urban areas that are also important, like Calgary and Winnipeg and Regina. And we began thinking about, well, what does a disability aesthetic look like elsewhere? What does it mean when you are maybe the only disabled artist in your town or in your village? What does it mean when, disability and indigeneity and the North are interconnected and sometimes conflicting concepts? So what does it mean to make this art remotely? And so we wanted to think about that. And we also wanted to think about digital divides, especially given that COVID-19 has moved a lot of things online, and digital divides have been somewhat compounded in this time. So our, conversations about accessing the arts can't just look to the internet as a solution. There has to be something more. There has to be something sort of different there. And even in terms of making access checklists and things like that, what does it mean when, you want to make an access guide, but there is no bus in your town, so there is no way to get there? What does that mean for you? How are you making art? How are you being an artist in this way? And so these were some of the questions that we had for rural artists, and we're still interviewing some of them, so we don't fully sort of know the answers yet, but what we are coming to discern is that livelihood and artistry has something to do with the dreaming, with dreaming about the future and imagining the future in particular ways, and that the sort of urban-rural divide, which is increasingly complicated and increasingly sort of a mythology, has something to do with that as well. So I'm not sure. I might have deviated from your question, so feel free to pull me back on track, Cole, if you like.
No, that's fascinating. I grew up in a rural Southern Alberta part of our province, and my family all still lives there. And I'm just endlessly fascinated with stereotypes that exist, and myths, like you say, of urban and rural divides, but also the very real differences that can be present, both in terms of literal infrastructure and population numbers and things like that, but also the more intangible cultural and sociological differences. So no, thank you. It's just a perennial fascination of mine.
Yeah, I also grew up in a small town in Manitoba, so maybe that's, maybe it's all just, it's all got some childhood roots or something like that.
We all have a lot in common.
Julie, I'm curious in your work if, not that I want us to talk about COVID very much, but I am curious about the things that we've learned over the last couple of years and some of the ways that remote and digital collaboration and connection has potentially added to our practice or complicated our practices. Now that we're, imagining some vague distant light at the end of the tunnel, I am curious how some of these new to me anyways, digital and remote communication tools, that you see them being involved in your practice moving forward.
I would say that even if it required a lot of rethinking of the method we had to put communities together and work together, even if it was a little complicated to put together, at this point, I don't know how we could get going without that. It saved us so much complication in order to put two communities together, which both had their space of work equipped with internet and camera and Zoom, and also how it was a little less violent to introduce people together in a much more uh, well get staying in your safe space. I could keep people that are rather anxious in a place where they feel safe and secure, and that screen gave them the opportunity to be a little more open. So I'm thinking we will keep this remote working station as long as we can. And also it's much easier in terms of like transportation and everything. That would have been so complicated to get like waivers to get a kid in a bus and move and like come back, and then it would have taken 3 hours. So most likely way less interaction in real time to progress on stuff. So right now, as I'm saying, it was really unfortunate, everything we've been through. It was mad, but today I'm thinking, wow, it gave us the opportunity to develop something I would have never thought of. And also we can keep trace on that just by the fact that as we're doing now, we're recording, and it's great to be able to archive everything that we're doing, get back to it, keep all those traces there. It's so much easier to work that way. But what something I've realized is a lot of people that I've worked with that are really introverted, that wouldn't actually participate that much, were taking much more space. A screen was something else for them that they were used to. They play video games, they have another character, they could let it themselves in much more freedom. So ideally, I would like to organize in-person meeting and interaction. That would be fantastic if we could have both of them eventually. But for now, I think it was just a blessing in disguise.
Yeah.
That's what I would say on that.
Oh, it's so interesting. Yeah, thinking about just temperamentally how we all react and exist differently on these platforms like this conversation we're having now, and how, yeah, for some people it can be really freeing, and because there's a level of safety, and for some people it can be really dispiriting and hard to connect or express yourself, and that person may feel different on the following day. I know for us at Inside Out, it's opened up a whole world of possibilities for us as well, particularly for folks that find traveling outside of their house really burdensome, whether someone who uses a wheelchair or mobility devices and is dependent on our kind of public accessible transit service, which is quite a bureaucracy for folks to navigate, or even, we have a blind coworker here at Inside Out who finds, navigating expensive or dangerous at times. Like, this ability to choose to meet online has some very real world accessibility bonuses that we've found as well.
I think the operative thing is choice.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to be the tricky thing to figure out going forward. What avenues will get closed as people start to open up more in-person activities, and it becomes resource intensive to have something happen in a hybrid way, or just difficult to figure out the sociality of that. I know that even in relatively really well-resourced places like universities, that those are conversations we're having, because it's theirs too, students and faculty who feel safer, happier at home, working, very productive, and people who aren't doing well in those environments and need that personal contact. Yeah. And I wondered, could I raise something else, kind of different from this? One thing I keep thinking about is the assumption of the autonomy of a body. We do this in music all the time. A musician is a single person with an instrument, maybe, but but they can go alone into a practice room and learn their craft, right? It's assumed that yes, we might need to interact with one another, play music together, be in an ensemble in some way, but we really have this myth of the body that doesn't need another body to function. And I think that's another really big gift that this work has given me, is seeing how ability spreads across bodies. And when we bring a person with very involved disabilities together with a caregiver, that becomes a beautiful connected two body, that there is, I don't mean to romanticize at all, but I feel like there's a lesson there that we could learn that would also somehow help us with the meta question that this virtual versus in-person conversation has attached to it, which is really about what does it mean to support one another, to be intimate, to be in community. How are we touching one another, right? So I'm curious whether what you think about this idea of how many people is a body. That's a clumsy way to put it, but whether you have that same observation of maybe there's a different way to think about embodiment in this work, if that's not too eggheady.
Well, I'll say in my experience in community organizing in the disability world or disability justice, that the tenet of interdependence is quite core, and how that like which flips the switch on dependency, which is rooted in a more medical model of disability, but a strong community and full of different care webs of people and different types of relationships on different terms, but how interdependent a healthy community can be with each other. And also in my experience, like disability breaks down physical barriers a lot. Like there's a lot of touch and, rooted in care and collaboration and consent. That's just like almost table stakes, for a lot of disability organizing. Not without its, complications, but yeah, that idea of us of not being autonomous, wholly our own people, which I think is actually a broader COVID lesson. There's a theory from a legal scholar in the States named something Feynman, talking about the universal vulnerable subject, which is different than the, neoliberal version of the universal rational subject, where economists build models on assuming that all humans will act like computers and make rational decisions for themselves. But rather this theory of legal justice of everybody is vulnerable. Like that's the one universal trait that we have. Like we are all vulnerable humans. And I think COVID has made that so clear, that we are all vulnerable people, and that the way through, and the folks that I know that have thrived over the last couple of years, not just survived, but really been able to navigate the last couple of years in healthy ways, are folks with strong, healthy, interdependent communities that everyone is recognized as having a vulnerable body, and that's a shared experience, and that we can come together over that. Has just been really kind of omnipresent over the last couple of years for me. Chelsea or Julie, though, that was a great prompt and thought and question, Ellen. I would love to hear your thoughts.
Sure. I mean, my thoughts, Cole, echo some of yours. When Ellen, you asked that question, how many people is a body? I wrote it down. I really like that question. And, my internal compass pointed towards principles of disability justice and interdependence, and how those have been modeled by arts-based groups like Sins Invalid, and they've created these CRIP-centric liberated zones, which look a lot like relaxed performance practice, which is increasingly interdependent in and of itself. And also, I think there's something to interdependence in terms of accessibility standards. In some of our research, we've heard people say that something like relaxed performance in theater, for example. So when we interviewed theater students who were looking for jobs in the industry, who were going to go work in this sort of theater and performance industry in Canada, they identified relaxed performance training as a gold standard in their industry, saying that they needed more of it and they needed it earlier in their programs. And this was a really important finding for us because they recognized that interdependence was part of the arts-based work that they were going to have to do if they were to sort of put some, let those kind of EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion principles hold water, right? If they were actually going to patch up some holes in those buzzwords, they had to do the real work of interdependence. So this is one of the things that we know students are asking for in some performance-centric programs in universities. And so, yeah, I mean, I just think it's so interesting how many people is a body. And if you think about, a body of work, for example, it's so many people. And even though you can have that experience of going into a room and practicing your instrument by yourself or doing something by yourself, it always takes sort of a body of work to even get you to the room. So teaching students about interdependence, I think is crucial at this point in time. And I'll pass it to Julie now.
I think I'd really love to just ask a question for clarity, and I might not be the only one who needs that clarification, but please tell me about this relaxed performance that I've heard for a while. I'd love to know. I have ideas, but
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. I might have just thrown those words out there without explaining, which isn't very fair or very accessible of me. So I apologize. Yeah. So relaxed performance is it started off as a theater intervention based in autism communities in the United Kingdom, and in the past 5 years, organizations like the British Council Canada have been doing relaxed performance training across Canada. So it's sort of picking up some speed in Canada. And it's an accessibility intervention for performances that supports people in all aspects of the performance. So audiences, actors, producers, or whoever is sort of involved in making the performance itself more accessible for everyone. And a lot of what this means is figuring out what accessibility means in your community or in your context. So thinking about what kind of languages need to be in the room, what the context is of the performance, how to guide people to the performance, how to invite people who might otherwise not be involved into the performance. So people involved in the performance do all this kind of work. And I think, Cole, you might have a more thorough explanation because I know that some of the work that you do in Calgary is connected to relaxed performance, and also this idea of being a good host is connected to relaxed performance. But relaxed performance is often thought of in a theater context, but we've in the past couple of years seen it in like choir performances and fashion shows and in other contexts as well. So the idea of relaxing the performance is about making it more accessible to the people who are involved in sort of the local context. I hope that makes sense.
That was, yeah, great, Chelsea. And I'll just add one of my favorite things, and one favorite things about the relaxed performances, like kind of on the night, like when a relaxed performance is happening, is there's like technical things that a relaxed performance consultant will do to tone down the intensity of the show a bit for folks with different sensory processing ways. Like, yeah, looking out for like strobe lights and sudden bangs, things that are one of our main consultants calls them startles, things that make people jolt. But one of the fundamental things is relaxing, and by doing so, acknowledging the really strict theater going rules that companies have adopted, like the basic rule of like, you need to sit still silently in your chair for 2 hours. And that's the only way you're allowed to be in this space. And if you do anything different, you have to leave. A relaxed performance like acknowledges those rules usually exist, and that is not okay for a lot of people, that's just, that shouldn't be the requirement to see a play, is the ability to sit silently for a couple of hours. And so it's really an invitation for everybody in the space to like accept who they are and how they need to be able to be there, and to do that for your neighbor or the person sitting next to you or anyone else in the room. Because what it says explicitly is that if someone makes a lot of involuntary sound or someone moves a bit, they're not being a jerk. Like they're not doing that because they don't care about manners or politeness or decorum. That's who they are. And by relaxing the rules, they get to be here to experience this art in the same way that you do. And isn't that a nice thing? And so that's just like in like on the date when it's happening. That's one of the things Relaxed Performances does, and that's beautiful for everybody. Everybody is grateful to know that if you really have to, if it's a 100-minute long 1-act play and it's 75 minutes in, you have to pee, that you could like just run to the washroom and come back, and that's okay. Like that's like it's one of those often said kind of idioms around accessibility or universal design or things like that, is that a change or an alteration or an adaptation could be made with one particular experience in mind, but that it almost always benefits everybody. Yeah. Wow, folks, I'm just clocking the time, and we are humming along the clock, and we are nearing the end of our time together for this chat. I truly hope it's not the last time we all get to speak together. As we start to wrap up, yeah, Chelsea?
I'm so sorry to interrupt. I think Julie had something to say. I'm not sure.
I'm not sure if we still have time. I'm okay to maybe ask you privately later. I was definitely, I had some curiosity and maybe a quick question. Ask.
Terry says we have 15 minutes.
Okay, so should I go? Well, thank you so much. We could do it really quickly, but part of something that I keep struggling, like I'm still struggling about the program we're running right now. And I feel like a part of the accessibility would also be to be able to perform. And with the type of program I'm running, performance is really hard to imagine. It's really hard to take certain person out of a. It would require a lot of organization to get people inside a room and do a performance as we know it. But I think a big part of accessibility is also to be seen, and a part of someone who performs also exists because it is seen. And I was wondering how it worked with your own programs in terms of how do you see performances, and do you see it as something that has to be part of the process that you're running, or is it something that only feeds the ego, or is this something that should be crucial too as a part of a, of a program?
Yeah, well, I'll say for us here at Inside Out, we have quite a range of programs. Everything from like really on the ground community programs for any community member to join and create together and learn and participate. Sometimes here at our own venue at Inside Out, and sometimes some of our artists or facilitators will go visit other programs or things like that and work at their facilities, or online, doing a lot of online work. And on the kind of other side of the company, we have full-blown professional productions and presentations created by deaf artists and disabled and mad artists. And for me, where like how performance sits in there is really about the goals and intention of both the artists in the program and as the facilitator or driver of the program, like what is the purpose of what you're doing. And sometimes performance is a really meaningful goal or purpose of that, especially if it's coming from the artists or participants. And then what kind of performance fits that, you know? So some of our programs end up like in a theater, and we do performances there. Sometimes we like just invite on the last day, do kind of final presentations. And because for those artists, the meaningful thing is that they're like family and friends get to watch them perform because they've been talking about this, you know, play they've been making or these things they've been learning for the last few months, and getting to share it, not on a big stage necessarily, not with, you know, a huge crowd, but the people that they have in their lives, and it's important for them to see. Like, so that is a kind of performance that matches those goals. And we've, especially over the last couple of years, but even before that, have spent more time getting archival videos or recording performances, even in studio, because people have, like, you know, mixed families who live in different cities and things like that, and a chance for them to share a nice recording or digital version of what they've been doing is really helpful. So yeah, I think it's an entirely valid and great goal to have to want to end in a performance. And then it is that balance of what's meaningful for yourself and the artists, what's possible and like within your capacity, what's safe, you know, is a new or more heightened consideration to have. Yeah, those are some of the questions that we talk about here anyways.
Thank you. That was a good answer for me.
Well, folks, in our last few minutes, I love being in the role of getting to kind of facilitate conversations like this. I'm very grateful for it, but I'm also terrible at ending conversations like this because I could just keep chatting with you forever. But you know, I'm here in Calgary, so it's still mid-afternoon for me. Julie, I don't know if you can tell, but there's been like a beautiful lighting design in your room over this conversation, and I can tell that twilight is setting in where you are. So anyways, we will have to end at a certain point. So maybe as a final chance, we'll kind of go around the horn and just a chance for some final reflections on this conversation, or, you know, the way we've been thinking about this over the last little while. Just a chance for a final reflection, and then we'll check back in with Terry. So I'll ask you to start, Ellen.
Well, I think I'm grateful for this conversation and to be in dialogue with other people who are, you know, doing this kind of work. I'm not sure what this kind of work means, except that it is work that is exceptionally enriching, and not for, you know, ideas of service or doing good or some silly thing like that. It's enriching because of what how for me, how it's expanding my own consciousness as a musician, my own sense of being in community and being interdependent with other people, and the idea of imagination, the amazing possibilities that open up if we can imagine a more accessible sphere of arts. Yeah, we all, I guess what I'm trying to say in a clumsy way is we all stand to benefit, right? We all have a lot to benefit from that.
Thank you, Ellen. Julie, would you like to go next?
Of course, I mean, once again, it was such an inspiring moment, and I was already excited about seeing all the possibilities and what's left to do or what's left to learn. And now I see that that to keep that conversation going and feed each other in that way will definitely be one of the keys in us keeping our curiosity alive for once, and that exchange of good practices I feel is it to me it is a really lonely work. And now I feel like, oh no, no, it is all in my head, that idea that it's a lonely work. I mean, working inside small communities might make you think, am I the only one that is am I lost in this way? Is it going anywhere? Would it um, serve only myself? But now I can see it as an opportunity to uh, so sorry, brain is dead. Alors, c'est une belle opportunité de connecter des savoirs, mais certainement pas seulement des savoirs qu'on partage en tant qu'intervenant, mais des savoirs qu'on retire de nos communautés et qu'on partage plus globalement. Donc, merci beaucoup. C'était fantastique et merveilleux. Puis pour la patience et toutes ces informations partagées. Merci à tous.
Thank you so much, Julie. Chelsea, a final for now thought from you?
Yeah, final for now thought. I like that. It's just really delightful to be able to engage with people after, it's been months since that video was put together, and it was so interesting to learn about your work then, and then to hear your reflections on it today in the context of this conversation. So thank you. And I don't know, sort of a key theme that's popping out for me from this conversation is this reminder that, access can be so many things. It can be flexible, improvisational, it can be intergenerational, it can be embodied, and how many bodies is a body and how many bodies is an accessible body? There's all these questions sort of coming from this conversation. And so I thank you for all of those offerings as we go forward.
Nice summary.
It's perfect. Yeah, I'm just very grateful. I'm also grateful that this is recorded because about halfway through, I was, writing notes, and I was like, oh, I was like, oh, no, I can just be present here, and then I'll watch it again later and take notes and think further, because there's so much wonderful food for thought here. So thank you all so much. And thank you, Terry. When I can pass the Zoom mic back to you if you like.
Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation and for all of your contributions, both to the forum and to our community in Canada, because it's such inspiring work, and I'm so grateful that we have an opportunity to let people know more about it. And so I'm really grateful for both the video that you made for forum as well as this conversation. And I also hope that that it keeps going, that it's only bye for now, and that we will all meet again, possibly in more physical form at some point, as that becomes available to us. But it's also wonderful to be able to have these tools now that can spread all of this around and make it available to people at different times when it becomes important for them and when they have questions that need answering. So again, thank you all, and I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of the day and a sweet and gentle movement into spring as we've survived the winter. And best of luck in all of your projects and with all of your collaborators and communities.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.